President Lagos, you are the former president of Chile and special envoy for the UN to Copenhagen. You have been taking part in meetings in this conference. Where do we stand? Are we seeing already the light out of the tunnel?
Well, somebody told me that you can see the light out of the tunnel, but the problem is, are we going to find the tunnel? And in order to find the tunnel, I think that it's going to be extremely important to understand that if we accept Kyoto, as everybody would say now, Kyoto is there, then there is any way by which developing countries, the major emitters, or the middle income countries are in a position to propose some, the so-called NAMAs, nationally appropriate mitigation actions. And are those nationally appropriate mitigation actions, if a substantial number of developing countries propose those NAMAs, if it's possible to think that those NAMAs may be binding if 50% or whatever the number of the emissions of developing countries are going to be, because developed countries have targets, no matter, it's up to them how they are going to reduce emissions. But if a developing country say, I would like to reduce emissions from the point of view of my decreasing the rate of deforestation, I would like to decrease emissions because my economic growth is going to be energy efficiency. These are the things that are going to be measured, very specific. And therefore, this may be one way to solve the problems here in this conference. Well, still we have, in the jargon of the UN system, too many brackets. That means that still there is quite a number of issues that have not been clarified for the moment. Nevertheless, I think that some advance is going to be possible to have with regard to monitor, verification and reporting. Number two, I still think that now developing countries agree with regard to MRV, that MRV had exist with regard to those actions to mitigate emissions that are financed by external sources. That, I think, is very clear. Now, the other point is, if it is possible to have some MRV also with regard to some other areas, and I think that there is some prospect to work in that direction today.
Do you think that there will be a final solution in this conference?
No, I wouldn't say it's the final solution. The final solution is to take actions to mitigate the emissions. But at least it's very important from the point of view of transparency that the action that I am going to take, some international body are going to verify that what I say I'm doing is true. So from the point of view of transparency, I think this is very important.
But it looks like the poor countries, the developing countries, is very far off from the rich countries right now.
Yes, and my point is that at least with regard to those actions that are being financed by external sources, those actions are going to be subject to a monitor, report and verification.
Is it a positive sign that Japan and some other countries in the EU now is willing to put in much bigger sum of money into
Well, that I think is very positive, because the bigger the money, the bigger the areas where you are going to report, monitor and verify. And therefore, it's a quid pro quo, you know. The bigger the money, the bigger the technology transfer, the bigger are going to be the actions that are going to be monitored by the international community.
But how do you get China, India and the US into a deal?
Well, I think that one way to do it would be, if it is possible, that on a voluntary basis you make some particular commitments, and if some other countries similar to you, I mean rapidly emerging countries, middle income countries, that means countries that don't qualify for foreign aid. You are talking about Latin America, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Peru, Argentina are countries that don't qualify for foreign aid. Therefore, what if those countries present NAMAs, these national appropriate mitigation actions, and they say, well, I would be willing to open this to verification for the international community. That would be a very important advance. Number two, what if those countries say, look, this is what I present on a voluntary basis. But if, let's say, 50% of emissions of developing countries present numbers similar to the one that I presented in my country, well, it is possible to think that those national appropriate mitigation actions then may be binding. In other words, the fact that my proposal may be binding depends if the other developing countries do similar proposals. And that means then that I'm not modifying the Kyoto Protocol that say that me as a developing country, whatever I say is not binding. In this case, I would say, I would like to see some voluntary targets by developing countries with regard to specific actions, and those actions then can be binding if some other developing country do the same.
Mr. President, what do you think, how would it look like tomorrow evening on the table? What is on the table tomorrow evening? Do we have it?
I would like to think that something of the kind of thing that I'm telling you may be the way out. Because if you're going to have the major leaders of the world, they cannot return to their own country with their hands empty. And if they want to have something, I think that somebody has to give something. And this, I think, is a way that after Poznan, it was very clear that Kyoto, with the difference between Annex 1 countries and non-Annex 1 countries, are not going to be modified. Okay? That's clear. Then, if that is clear, how can we then have a solution to the problem where the major polluters or the major emitters, if you want me to say it that way, or the countries that 10 years later after Kyoto are middle-income countries? You have to take into account that things in the world have changed, and you didn't have a G20 in 1998. Now you have a G20. So if you are part of the G20, then you also should share some responsibilities, because now you are in another stage. And therefore, how are you going to be able to do that without violating, without forgetting Kyoto? I make a national appropriate mitigation action, I put that on the table, and then I say, this is voluntary. It's not binding, but I accept that may be binding if and only if some other colleagues, some other countries similar to my country will accept it.
Thank you
But
very
Kyoto
much,
was
President.
not ratified
And,
by the US. Kyoto was not ratified by the US. So how maybe not going back to the convention wouldn't be a better idea? Some experts are saying, why not go back to the convention, since it's spelled out in Article 2.4b that actually we have to go back to
The point is this,
1990.
that developing countries think, and I think it's correct for them, that Kyoto make a very clear distinction between developed and developing countries. Developed has to make, has to fulfill a target that is binding. Developing, no. So I think that when you have a proposal like the one that I'm saying, you keep Kyoto, but on a voluntary basis, you make an offer, and that offer is only going to be binding if somebody else make a similar pledge. It's very much like Kyoto. In Kyoto, what you say is that Kyoto, because Kyoto, you remember, in Kyoto, you need a particular number of countries so that when emissions is beyond a particular level, then Kyoto is binding. All what I'm saying is something similar, but outside Kyoto.